Tony's violence feels inevitable, like fate catching up with him, one more body to add to a life already weighed down by sin. But when Tony Soprano kills his cousin, Tony Blundetto, it's different. It's not rage, it's not business, it's not even self-defense. It's something colder, something smaller, and far more revealing. It's Tony reclaiming authorship over a world that no longer answers to him. On the surface, the scene is meant to read as a mercy killing. Tony B has gone too far. He's murdered Billy Leotardo in a flash of vengeance, igniting a war between New York and New Jersey. He's on the run, hiding in a remote farmhouse, waiting for the inevitable. Phil Leotardo, Billy's brother, wants revenge. Everyone knows what that means. Torture. Humiliation. A slow death designed for spectacle. Tony Soprano, ever the pragmatist, decides to spare his cousin that fate. He drives out, shotgun in hand, and pulls the trigger before New York can reach him. It's clean, swift, merciful, or at least that's what Tony tells himself. But beneath that story, there's another one. One that strips away the illusion of compassion and exposes what Tony really wanted. Control. Not mercy, not closure. Control. Because if there's one thing Tony Soprano could never stomach, it's watching someone else decide how the story ends. Tony Blundetto's arc is one of the more tragic in the show. He's Tony's blood. His cousin, his mirror, the man who reminds him that there was once a fork in the road. Tony B was supposed to go to college. He was the smart one, the one who had options. But a single bad decision, getting caught up in a hijacking, lands him in prison for nearly 20 years. While Tony Soprano builds an empire, Tony B rots behind bars, dreaming of redemption. When he gets out, he tries to go straight. He works at a massage parlor, studies for a legitimate business license, and stays away from the life. But for Tony Soprano, that kind of clean slate feels like an insult. It's not that Tony doesn't want his cousin to succeed, it's that he can't stand the thought that someone like him could escape. Every time Tony B smiles, it reminds him of what he himself could have been if he'd made different choices. That resentment festers quietly under the surface until Tony B snaps. After his friend Angelo is murdered by Phil Leotardo's crew, Tony B retaliates, whacking Billy Leotardo and wounding Phil. It's a move so impulsive, so chaotic, that it throws the delicate balance between the families into collapse. Tony Soprano's first instinct isn't to protect his cousin, it's to manage the optics, the politics, the power. He starts calculating immediately. Who knows what? Who'll retaliate? Who'll blame him? Because in this world, image is survival. And here lies the foundation of the act that's about to come. Tony's mercy is not born from love, but from fear. The fear of appearing weak, of being outmaneuvered, of letting another man like Phil Leotardo dictate the terms. Phil Leotardo is everything Tony despises in another boss. Vain, vindictive, obsessed with old-world pride. When Phil loses his brother, it's not about business anymore. It's personal, tribal, biblical. He wants to hurt Tony Soprano, not just physically, but symbolically, to humiliate him, to take from him what Tony values most: respect. Phil's brand of vengeance is the kind Tony understands all too well. It's slow, theatrical, and drawn out. When he says he wants Tony Blundetto, he doesn't mean it metaphorically. He wants the man's body. He wants to break him, carve him up, and send a message. And Tony can't let that happen. Not because of family loyalty or decency, but because it would mean surrender. It would mean letting Phil Leotardo write the ending. Tony Soprano lives by a strange code of pride. He'll betray friends, whack cousins, destroy marriages, but he can't let anyone else have the last move. His entire identity as a boss depends on the illusion that he's in control. Losing control, even symbolically, means the world around him no longer revolves on his terms. That's why the whacking of Tony B becomes more than just an act of violence. It becomes a statement. Tony Soprano's final assertion that he decides what happens. If you take Tony's words at face value, the whacking seems almost humane. He tells people he did it so Phil wouldn't get to him. He paints it as a tragic necessity, and maybe on some level he believes that. But that's the trick with Tony Soprano. He always finds a way to moralize his cruelty. Every sin needs a justification. Every selfish impulse gets dressed up as leadership. When he whacks Ralph Cifaretto, it's because Ralph crossed a line. When he whacks Christopher, it's because Christopher was a liability. When he whacks Tony Blundetto, it's because he's sparing him suffering. In every case, Tony's violence is wrapped in a narrative that protects his ego. But the tone of the scene gives it away. The way he approaches the farmhouse, alone, calm, methodical, doesn't feel like compassion. It feels like ceremony. He's not grieving. He's performing. This isn't a man burdened by the weight of what he's about to do. It's a man reasserting dominance over chaos. He could have turned Tony B over. He could have negotiated. He could have let the politics play out. But none of those options gave him what he really wanted. The satisfaction of being the one to decide how it ends. In a world full of unpredictable enemies and crumbling loyalties, whacking his cousin himself was the only move that restored the illusion that Tony Soprano was still the center of gravity. Control is Tony's addiction. It's the drug that fuels him even more than money or sex or food. Throughout the series, he tries to control everything. His family, his crew, his therapy sessions, even his dreams. And yet, every season chips away at that control a little more. He can't control Carmela's resentment. He can't control Meadow growing up. He can't control AJ's depression or Chris's addiction or Paulie's paranoia. Even his therapy with Dr. Melfi becomes a battlefield of power, a place where he pretends to open up while subtly manipulating the dynamic to keep himself dominant. So when the world starts closing in, when the New York families start dictating the terms, Tony does the one thing he's always done to feel in charge. He takes a light. Whacking Tony B isn't a rational act, it's a reflex, a way to rewrite a situation that makes him feel small. Phil Leotardo wants revenge. Fine. But Tony will make sure it happens his way. It's not about mercy, it's about authorship. If Tony whacks him, then the story belongs to him. If Phil whacks him, then Tony becomes a footnote in someone else's saga. That's the twisted pride of a man like Tony Soprano. He would rather carry the guilt of murder than the humiliation of being upstaged. The brilliance of the moment lies in how quiet it is. There's no argument, no breakdown, no speech. Just Tony, walking into the farmhouse, finding his cousin, and pulling the trigger. It's not theatrical, it's surgical. A single moment of decision that feels less like vengeance and more like punctuation. The silence around it tells the story better than words could, because that's how Tony deals with guilt. He doesn't talk about it, he buries it. He compartmentalizes every act of cruelty until it becomes just another business move. But the visual symbolism of that act is unmistakable. Tony drives to a remote place, away from the noise, away from the family, away from any witnesses, and whacks the last person who still mirrors his humanity. The cousin who might have escaped the life becomes fertilizer for the legacy Tony can't let go of. It's not a mercy whacking, it's self-erasure disguised as duty. The real tragedy of it all is that Phil Leotardo still wins. Tony may have denied him the physical satisfaction of torturing Tony B, but the emotional satisfaction, the power to make Tony act out of fear, that's already his. Phil doesn't have to pull the trigger. Tony does it for him. That's the paradox of Tony's decision. In trying to deny Phil control, he actually validates it. He proves that Phil's rage, his vengeance, his posturing, it all matters enough to dictate Tony's behavior. Tony doesn't whack his cousin because it's the right thing to do. He whacks him because he's reacting to Phil's threat. The act is still centered around Phil's influence, not Tony's free will. So even in reclaiming control, Tony's still acting out of submission. He's trapped in a psychological loop where every attempt to assert power only exposes how powerless he truly is. This is what separates him from the old school bosses he idolizes. Guys like Johnny Sack or even Carmine understood diplomacy. They knew how to let things breathe. Tony only knows how to smother. He sees every conflict as a personal test of dominance, every slight as an attack on his identity. Whacking Tony Blundetto might make him feel strong for a day, but it comes at the cost of his soul. What's haunting about this act is how little it seems to haunt him. Tony doesn't break down afterward. He doesn't lose sleep. He compartmentalizes it as just another decision in a long list of necessary evils. But if you watch closely, the toll shows up elsewhere. In the way his paranoia spikes, in the way his temper becomes shorter, in the way his inner world starts to collapse. By this point in the series, Tony's violence no longer feels like survival. It feels like routine. Whacking doesn't carry moral weight for him anymore. It's just another tool in the kit. That numbness is what makes this his true moral decay. He's not even pretending to care. And yet, somewhere deep down, Tony knows what he's lost. You can see it in the way he later reacts to Phil's continued hostility. He thought whacking Tony B would end the feud, that by removing the symbol of conflict, he'd restore balance. But that's not how this world works. The act only deepens the wound. Phil sees it as disrespect, a man stealing his revenge. Tony sees it as resolution. Neither side is satisfied, and both spiral deeper into destruction. The irony is that the very thing Tony tried to prevent, Phil's satisfaction, ends up happening anyway, just in another form. When Phil eventually rises to power and wages war on Tony's family, it's the culmination of this decision. Tony's need to own the ending created an ending he could no longer control. Tony's moral logic has always been circular. He believes he's protecting his family, but every action he takes destroys it a little more. He believes he's showing strength, but every show of strength isolates him further. The whacking of Tony Blundetto is that logic distilled to its purest form, a decision that looks strong, but is built entirely on weakness. Tony's pride won't let him hand his cousin over. His ego won't let Phil have the final move. And so he makes a choice that satisfies neither morality nor pragmatism. It's not mercy, and it's not leadership. It's vanity. Pure, stubborn vanity masquerading as loyalty. When you strip away the context, what you're left with is a man whacking the last living reminder of who he could have been, all to stop another man from feeling satisfaction. It's not about business or power anymore. It's about emotion, about resentment, about Tony's pathological need to remain the center of the universe, even as the universe itself stops listening. The final irony is that Tony doesn't gain anything from the act. Phil still wants revenge. The family still view Tony as unstable, and Tony himself is left with nothing but another body on his conscience. But in his mind, he's won, because Tony measures victory not by peace or justice, but by authorship. As long as he gets to decide who lives and who dies, he believes he's in control. That's the delusion that carries him all the way to the end of the series, the belief that his decisions still shape the world around him. The truth, of course, is that by this point, the world has already moved on. The New York bosses see him as unreliable. His own crew is fractured. His family is emotionally gone. He's fighting ghosts, trying to control outcomes that no longer exist. Whacking Tony Blundetto wasn't the act of a strong man making a hard choice. It was the act of a desperate man trying to freeze time, trying to hold on to a version of himself that still mattered. Every major death Tony causes in The Sopranos carries a piece of himself with it. Ralphie's death kills the part of him that could rationalize his violence. Christopher's death kills the part of him that could feel love. Tony Blundetto's death kills the part of him that could accept fate. After that point, he's no longer a man reacting to the world. He's a man creating destruction just to feel alive. Whacking his cousin isn't just about denying Phil satisfaction. It's about proving to himself that he still has agency, that he can still steer the ship, that he hasn't become irrelevant. But that illusion of agency comes with a cost, because every time Tony reasserts control through violence, he tightens the noose around his own soul. The world doesn't bend to his will, it just becomes smaller. By the end of the series, Tony is a man surrounded by silence. His friends are dead, his enemies are multiplying, and his family drifts further away. The control he fought so hard to maintain has turned into isolation. And it all started with decisions like this one. Moments where he chose pride over peace, authorship over acceptance. So was it a mercy whacking? In the literal sense, maybe. Tony did spare his cousin from torture. But in the moral sense, it wasn't mercy, it was theater. A symbolic act meant to restore balance to Tony's ego, not to the world. He didn't whack Tony Blundetto out of love. He whacked him out of resentment. Resentment toward Phil for trying to take his power. Resentment toward Tony B for creating the mess. And resentment toward himself for caring enough to feel threatened by either. It's a move that encapsulates everything that makes Tony Soprano who he is. Pride, insecurity, and the pathological need to control every ending, even if it means writing his own tragedy. When he pulls that trigger, Tony isn't saving anyone. He's simply refusing to be outshined. He's denying Phil Leotardo a story to tell. He's telling himself that, as long as he's the one holding the gun, he's still the author of this world. But deep down, the truth is already clear. The world doesn't belong to Tony Soprano anymore. He just hasn't realized it yet.